Other databases, there's what's called a usage and health data collection service that has a logging database. It stores health monitoring information for your farm. So rather than have that stored on individual servers on the web front ends, it instead moves it into these databases so that it can be reused and you can have a centralized location for storing health information about your farm. There's search administration databases, property databases, and crawl databases, all which are used by the search service. So those three types of databases are used to store information about search. They're also some of the most heavily used databases within your SharePoint farm. So you want to make sure that you're properly giving enough resources to those databases. There's another service called Web Analytics Service that's used to analyze web traffic to your system, and it has both the staging and a reporting database that's part of the farm. The Managed Metadata Service, which was one of the responses I had this morning in the keynote to one of my favorite services in SharePoint. Managed Metadata is a service that's used to define taxonomy across your entire farm. So managed metadata basically can be used to say that I want a single column of metadata that exists in every document library across the entire farm. And if you've used SharePoint 2007 today, you know that that's a very difficult thing to do, is to try to define your taxonomy across the entire organization. Well, the Managed Metadata Service can do that across your farm, across all the site collections, across all the document libraries, and even across multiple farms if necessary. So for our clients that use document management heavily in SharePoint, this is probably one of the best services for them because it allows them to define that taxonomy across your farm. Other databases, there's profile synchronization and social tagging databases, which are used for the social networking aspect of SharePoint. And I believe Joel Olson, for example, has a session that goes into detail on how you can set up business-level social networking for organizations to define what people are doing within the organization and what their expertise is and that type of thing. There are other databases such as the BCS, the Business Connectivity Service, which is used to actually pull information from external data sources. You can have an Oracle database, you can have other types of databases within your organization, have it pulled into SharePoint and do a full rewrite against that content. And then, other databases, there's a store database, which is used as a replacement for the SSO database in 2007. And I mentioned also the TempDB, which is not a SharePoint database per se, it's actually a SQL-specific database. But the reason I put that here is because the TempDB is often neglected and people don't give it enough enough resources, disk resources. It's highly critical that you do that because the TempDB is used by every transaction in SharePoint. And probably the number one performance problem we see in SharePoint environments today in 2007 and of course going on to 2010 is the TempDB being neglected, not stored on fast disk. You want to do things like pre-size it so that it's larger. Let's say you start with a 30 gig TempDB so that it doesn't contract itself. You want to split it into multiple file groups in a lot of cases. There's a lot of best practices around TempDB. So take a look on the internet. There's some blog information about TempDB for SharePoint. Very useful. So from an administration perspective, a major change that's been made is the central admin service has been re-architected to be much more administrator friendly. It still uses a website. It still basically uses a site collection that's stored within a web application. So that hasn't changed. But what has changed is just basically the way that they organize the structure. And of course, your capabilities are much greater. You can access the service application tier. You can access all of the other key pieces of data within SharePoint. So you'll also see that what they did is they added the ribbon. So when you go through the central admin application, you'll see the ribbon show up depending on where you are. So you can actually do tasks quicker through the administrative ribbon. You'll also note, by the way, on this particular slide, this is just about half of the service applications which are turned on this particular service. So we've got the Business Data Connectivity Service, Excel Services, Managed Metadata Service, which I talked about. They're basically all applications and service applications that you can turn on within SharePoint. Now, a caution with that, don't just turn everything on because you can. Microsoft actually makes it, unfortunately, a little too easy because they have a wizard that you run through called the configuration wizard, that when you run that, it'll actually turn all of the, by default, turn all of the service applications on. Well, these service applications can take a great deal of the processor and memory of that particular system. So if you turn them on, you're basically taking away the resources from just standard web traffic into SharePoint. So make sure that, for example, you want to use Excel services before you turn it on. Otherwise, leave them off and then maybe turn them on later once you've established a plan to use those particular service applications. And the other major change from an administrative perspective is that PowerShell has been added in as the kind of default administrative tool for SharePoint. If you're not familiar with PowerShell, it's Microsoft's shell command line utility that allows you to do administration from the command line. So it has hundreds, I think somewhere over 500 different commandlets, what they call commandlets, that allow you to extract information from SharePoint, allow you to do specific tasks. It's a very powerful tool to be able to administer an environment. For example, we actually have a PowerShell script that's also in the book that allows you to completely configure a farm from scratch. So it just goes through and automatically creates all of its settings and turns on the service applications that you need from scratch. So it's a very powerful way to automatically script an environment and create new SharePoint farms and add new services and turn on web applications and site collections and those things. Okay, so it's important to understand, especially if you're coming from SharePoint 2007, what the main architectural differences are between 2007 and 2010, because the way you architected the farm before is not the way that you'd architected in 2010. By the way, the general rule of thumb with 2010 is it's going to require much, much more resources than you're used to in 2007. So be prepared, for example, it used to be that people would go out and put 4 gigs of RAM into a SharePoint system, sometimes even less, and they'd be okay in 2007. You can't do that anymore. You've got to have 6, 8 gigs of RAM at least, depending on the services that are running on the server. So be prepared that SharePoint is going to require a much greater deal of resources on your system. So as far as the roles go, the web role is essentially the same as it was in SharePoint 2007. Where the changes start is in the search service. So within the search service, there's some significant changes. The query role, for example, is moved together with the index role, and it's made more redundant. In the past, you could only have one index server per shared services provider. Now the concept of the shared services provider is gone and replaced with the service application model. So you can actually have redundant search services built into it. And then from a database perspective, the major change is that it's only supported to use 64-bit databases now, and it's only SQL 2005, 2008, or the latest version, SQL 2008 R2, which is the preferred version of working with SharePoint 2010. Okay, so architecturally, just to understand how one model in 2000